April 1945. The rolling hills of Bavaria stretched endlessly under a grey sky as thousands of German women prisoners trudged westward along muddy roads, their faces etched with exhaustion and uncertainty. They had heard stories about their captors, about what awaited them in Allied hands, but nothing could have prepared them for what they were about to witness. In their minds, shaped by years of propaganda and isolation, they believed they understood the world beyond their borders. They were about to discover how profoundly wrong they had been. Before we dive into this story, make sure to subscribe to the channel and tell me in the comments where you are watching from. It really helps support the channel. What began as a routine prisoner transfer would become a transformative encounter that shattered deeply ingrained beliefs and revealed the vast gap between propaganda and reality, forever changing how these women understood humanity itself. Maria Schneider, a 28-year-old auxiliary worker from Munich, had served in administrative capacities, supporting German military operations for nearly 4 years. Now, along with approximately 3,000 other women, she found herself part of a massive column of prisoners being relocated by American forces. The April air still carried winter's bite, and the women walked wrapped in whatever clothing they had managed to keep, their breath visible in the cold morning light. Maria wore a thin grey coat that had once been part of her work uniform, now stained and torn from weeks of chaos as the German forces collapsed around them. She remembered the day clearly when everything changed. It was March 23rd, when American forces had swept through their administrative compound near Augsburg, with such speed that there had been no time to evacuate or destroy records. Maria had been filing supply requisitions when she heard the first sounds of American vehicles approaching. Within hours, she and hundreds of other women who worked in various support roles found themselves prisoners, herded into temporary holding areas, facing an uncertain future. The rumors had spread quickly through the column the night before. They would be guarded by a different kind of American soldier, ones they had been told about in whispers and warnings throughout the conflict. The propaganda newspapers Maria remembered from years past had painted terrifying pictures, using dehumanizing language and fabricated stories designed to instill fear. She recalled seeing posters in government buildings that depicted caricatures so grotesque, so divorced from reality, that she would later wonder how anyone could have believed them. Yet she had believed, or at least had never questioned what she was told. In the cramped barracks where the women had spent the previous night, conversations were hushed and anxious. The building had once been a German military storage facility, its windows broken, its concrete floor cold and unforgiving. The Americans had provided thin blankets and some food, more than many of the women had eaten in weeks, but comfort was impossible. They huddled in small groups, sharing body heat and fears. Gertrude Weber, a 42-year-old former factory supervisor from Stuttgart, sat near Maria that evening, her weathered hands wrapped around a tin cup of weak coffee provided by their captors. She had seen much during the conflict, had watched her city endure countless hardships, and considered herself practical and level-headed. Her factory had produced components for vehicles until Allied forces had reduced it to rubble in a series of attacks in 44. She had lost her husband in Russia in 43, her oldest son in France in 44, and her home in a firestorm in 45. Yet somehow she still maintained a core of resilient pragmatism that kept her moving forward. Then Gertrude said, her voice barely above a whisper, "Have you heard what kind of soldiers will be escorting us tomorrow? They say they are bringing in the Negro troops, the ones from Africa." Maria felt her stomach tighten with anxiety she could not quite articulate. "I have heard the stories, but I do not know what is true anymore. Everything we were told, it seems like it is all falling apart now. Look at how the American soldiers have treated us so far. They gave us food, blankets, medical attention. Nothing like what we were told to expect." Gertrude nodded slowly, her eyes distant. "My son wrote to me from France before he was taken down. He said the Americans had more of everything. More food, more vehicles, more ammunition, more medicine. He said fighting them was like trying to hold back the ocean with your hands. I thought he was exaggerating, trying to explain why they were losing. Now I see he was telling the simple truth." Across the room, young Helga Braun, barely 19 years old and who had worked as a communications clerk, listened with wide eyes. She had grown up entirely under the regime's influence, her education and worldview shaped entirely by its teachings. The world outside Germany existed in her mind only as her instructors had described it, and those descriptions had been uniformly negative when it came to people who looked different from herself. Helga's father had been a party official, her mother an enthusiastic supporter of the regime's policies. She had attended special schools, youth camps, indoctrination sessions disguised as educational programs. Everything she believed had been carefully constructed by others. Helga's voice trembled as she spoke to the older women near her. What if the stories are true? What if they really are as terrible as we were taught? What will happen to us? An older woman named Frida, perhaps 50 years old, reached out to pat Helga's arm with maternal comfort. Child, if they wanted to hurt us, they would have done so already. The Americans who captured us could have done anything. Instead, they gave us food and shelter. Whatever happens tomorrow, we must face it with dignity. But the fear was palpable in the room, mixing with exhaustion and despair to create an atmosphere of almost unbearable tension. Many of these women had lost everything: homes, families, futures. Their country lay in ruins, their leaders either deceased or in hiding, their entire worldview collapsing around them. And now they faced an encounter with people they had been taught to fear and despise, with no clear understanding of what that encounter would bring. Maria tried to sleep but found it impossible. She lay on the cold floor, her thin blanket pulled tight, thinking about her life before the conflict. She had been a university student once, studying literature and history in Munich. She had dreamed of becoming a teacher, of traveling, of experiencing the world beyond Bavaria. Then the conflict had consumed everything, and those dreams had faded like morning mist. Her brother had perished in the east, her fiancé in North Africa, her parents in the destruction of Munich. She was alone now, with nothing but memories and questions. One question kept returning to her mind as she lay there in the darkness: how much of what I believed was true, and how much was lies? She had accepted so much without question, had trusted authorities who claimed to be building a better world. Now that world lay in ashes, and she was left to wonder if any of it had ever been real, or if it had all been an elaborate fiction designed to manipulate people like herself. When morning came, the women were assembled in long columns on the muddy road. American officers moved efficiently through the groups, conducting headcounts and organizing the march. The spring sun finally broke through the clouds, casting long shadows across the landscape. Maria noticed how professional these American soldiers were, how different from the chaotic desperation she had witnessed in recent months among her own forces. These men had clean uniforms, working equipment, enough food to share with prisoners. They moved with the confidence of people who knew they had won, yet without the cruelty or arrogance she had somehow expected. A young American lieutenant, probably no older than 23 or 24, walked past checking the columns. He stopped when he saw a woman struggling with a heavy pack, took it from her without asking, and added it to the supplies in a nearby truck. The gesture was simple, almost automatic, but it spoke volumes. These were not monsters. They were just men, doing a job, treating prisoners with basic human decency. Then, from the eastern road, they appeared. The 92nd Infantry Division, known as the Buffalo Soldiers, had distinguished themselves throughout the Italian campaign and were now assigned to prisoner escort and security duties in the final weeks of the conflict in Europe. These African-American soldiers marched in perfect formation, their uniforms immaculate despite the muddy conditions, their bearing confident and disciplined. The morning sun caught their faces, highlighting skin tones the German women had never seen in person before. The effect on the women prisoners was immediate and profound. Maria stood frozen, her breath catching in her throat. In all her 28 years, she had never seen a black person in real life. The propaganda images she remembered bore no resemblance to the men before her now. Those images had been grotesque caricatures, designed to inspire fear and disgust. But these soldiers were men, clearly human, clearly professional, moving with military precision that matched or exceeded anything she had seen from German forces. Their equipment was impressive, modern, well-maintained. The trucks were newer models, the weapons gleamed with proper care. Even the boots the soldiers wore looked sturdy and new. Maria had watched German soldiers march in worn-out boots held together with wire, carrying weapons that frequently jammed, riding in vehicles that broke down constantly. These American soldiers had none of those problems. They represented industrial might on a scale that was almost incomprehensible. What struck Maria most, what made her question everything she had been taught, was something entirely unexpected. Their skin was beautiful. The propaganda had depicted black people as almost subhuman, with exaggerated features and terrifying expressions. But looking at these soldiers in the morning light, Maria saw men whose skin ranged from deep brown to lighter shades, each tone catching the sunlight differently, each face as individual and expressive as any German face. There was no monster here, no subhuman creature. There were just soldiers, men who looked tired and professional and entirely human. "I cannot believe it," whispered Helga beside her, her young face showing pure astonishment. "They look nothing like the pictures. Nothing at all. Look at how the sun catches their faces. It is like polished wood, like something beautiful and strong. They are just men. Why did they tell us they were monsters?" Gertrude, ever practical, was already assessing the soldiers with her factory supervisor's eye for detail and efficiency. "Look at their equipment," she murmured to Maria. "Everything is new. Everything works. Look at how much they have, the trucks, the supplies, the organization. This is what we were up against. How could we ever have won? They must produce more in a month than we managed in a year." Maria nodded slowly, still unable to take her eyes off the approaching soldiers. She was trying to reconcile what she saw with what she had been taught, and the cognitive dissonance was almost painful. Every instinct told her these were men, regular soldiers doing their duty. Yet years of propaganda whispered that she should be afraid, should be disgusted, should look away. The conflict between belief and reality created a tension in her chest that made breathing difficult. Staff Sergeant James Mitchell of the 365th Infantry Regiment, a 26-year-old from Mississippi who had fought his way through Italy, now found himself in the strange position of guarding people who had been taught to fear and despise him. He had experienced racism his entire life, had fought for a country that treated him as a second-class citizen, yet here he was, representing American power and values to these former enemies. Mitchell had grown up in rural Mississippi, the son of sharecroppers who had worked land they would never own. He had attended segregated schools, used segregated facilities, lived under segregation laws that made him a second-class citizen in his own country. When he enlisted in '42, he did so partly out of patriotism, partly because military service offered opportunities not available to black men in civilian life, and partly because he wanted to prove something, that black men could fight as well as anyone, that skin color had nothing to do with courage or competence. Italy had been brutal. The 92nd Division had fought in some of the worst terrain imaginable, assigned to difficult positions, often given inadequate support, expected to fail. They had not failed. They had fought with determination and skill, had taken their objectives, had proven themselves despite every obstacle. Mitchell himself had earned commendations for actions near Massa, where his squad had held a critical position against determined counterattacks for 3 days before relief arrived. Now, looking at the long columns of German women prisoners, Mitchell felt a complex mixture of emotions. These women had supported a regime that considered black people inferior, yet that same regime had just been defeated by, among others, black American soldiers. The irony was not lost on him. Neither was the opportunity. His commanders had made it clear, conduct yourselves with absolute professionalism. Show these people what American soldiers are, what free men look like. Mitchell had seen the looks on the women's faces when his unit arrived. He recognized that expression, had seen variations of it throughout his life. But this was different. This was not hatred or contempt. This was shock, confusion, and something else. Cognitive dissonance on a massive scale. These women had been taught lies, and now they were confronting truth. Mitchell understood the power of that moment, understood that how he and his fellow soldiers conducted themselves over the next few days could either confirm their prejudices or shatter them completely. Lieutenant Robert Hayes, the platoon commander and a graduate of Tuskegee Institute, gathered his non-commissioned officers for a brief meeting before the march began. Hayes was 31 years old, had earned his commission through exceptional performance, and understood better than most the significance of this moment. He had grown up in Detroit, where racial prejudice existed, but was less overt than in the South. His education at Tuskegee had prepared him for leadership, and his combat experience in Italy had hardened him into an effective officer. Hayes addressed his sergeants with calm authority, his voice carrying the weight of education and experience. "Gentlemen, we will conduct ourselves with the utmost professionalism. These prisoners have been taught lies about us their entire lives. Our conduct over the next few days will be the truth they cannot ignore. We show them what American soldiers are, what free men look like. No retaliation, no unnecessary harshness, but also no familiarity. We do our duty, we do it well, and we do it with dignity." He paused, making eye contact with each sergeant. "I know some of you have experienced terrible treatment from white Americans, both in the military and back home. I know some of you question why we fight for a country that denies us full equality. But remember this, we are not just representing America here. We are representing every black person who has been told they are inferior. We are proving through our actions that those lies are false. This is important work, perhaps more important than any battle we fought in Italy." Mitchell nodded, understanding completely. The soldiers of the 92nd had long since learned to let their performance speak for itself. In Italy, they had fought courageously despite being given the worst assignments and oldest equipment. Now, ironically, they were among the best supplied units in the European theater, their success having finally earned them proper support. The trucks they drove were new. The weapons they carried were well maintained. The uniforms they wore were complete and clean. They looked like what they were, professional soldiers of a powerful nation. Sergeant Thomas Wilson, a 34-year-old career soldier from Ohio, spoke up. "Sir, what do we do if any of these women try to cause trouble? I heard some of them were pretty hardcore in their beliefs." Hayes considered the question carefully. "If there is trouble, you handle it professionally and according to regulations. But I do not expect much trouble. These women are exhausted, defeated, facing an uncertain future. Most of them will be too concerned with survival to cause problems. And once they see how we treat them, I suspect many will reconsider what they have been taught." The meeting concluded, and the soldiers returned to their duties. The march began with Mitchell's squad taking positions along the left side of the column, maintaining proper spacing, keeping alert for any problems. It was standard escort duty, something they had done many times before, yet everyone sensed that this was different. This was not just about moving prisoners from one location to another. This was about representing something larger. Maria found herself walking near the middle of the column, surrounded by hundreds of other women, all processing what they were seeing. The Buffalo soldiers maintained perfect spacing along the column, professional and alert. They distributed water and rations efficiently, treated injured prisoners with matter-of-fact kindness, and showed none of the cruelty the women had been taught to expect. The first water stop came after about 2 hours of walking. The soldiers had set up distribution points along the road, with large water cans and cups available. The women lined up, still uncertain, still processing their shock. Mitchell supervised one of the distribution points, making sure the flow was orderly, ensuring everyone received their share. Maria watched him as she waited in line. He was perhaps 6 feet tall, with broad shoulders and strong hands that handled the heavy water cans with ease. His uniform was clean and pressed, his boots polished, despite the muddy roads. He wore sergeant's stripes with obvious pride. When he spoke to his soldiers, his voice was calm and authoritative. There was nothing in his bearing or appearance that suggested inferiority of any kind. He looked like a professional soldier, competent and confident. When Maria reached the front of the line, Mitchell handed her a cup of water without comment. Their eyes met for just a moment, and Maria felt a profound sense of shame. This man, this soldier who was showing her kindness, belonged to a group she had been taught to despise. Yet here he was, providing for her needs, treating her humanely, asking nothing in return. The contradiction was overwhelming. "Thank you," Maria said in German, knowing he probably would not understand the words, but hoping he would understand the meaning. Mitchell nodded, his face neutral, but not unfriendly. "You are welcome, ma'am," he replied in English, the words themselves meaningless to Maria, but the tone clear enough. The interaction lasted perhaps 10 seconds, but it shook Maria to her core. She moved away from the distribution point, drinking the cool water slowly, trying to process what she was feeling. It was not just shame, though that was certainly part of it. It was also a dawning awareness that she had been deceived on a fundamental level about the nature of humanity itself. By the second day, conversations among the prisoners had shifted dramatically. The initial shock had worn off, replaced by a more contemplative assessment of their situation. The women talked quietly as they walked, sharing observations and slowly, tentatively, admitting that what they had been taught bore no resemblance to what they were experiencing. Anna Richter, a 35-year-old nurse from Hamburg, had spent years caring for wounded soldiers and had developed a practiced eye for assessing people. She had seen the best and worst of humanity in hospital wards, had watched young men face death with courage or terror, had learned to recognize character through countless small observations. She spoke with Maria during a rest stop, her voice thoughtful and troubled. "I have been watching them, really watching," Anna said, gesturing subtly toward the soldiers. "They care for their equipment like German engineers. They maintain discipline like Prussian soldiers, and they show more humanity than many of our own guards did toward us. Everything I was taught about them was lies, complete lies, and I accepted those lies without question, without ever seeing for myself." Maria nodded slowly, still processing her own thoughts. "What disturbs me most is how easily I believed those lies. I considered myself educated, thoughtful. I attended university, I read books, I thought about ideas, yet I accepted such obvious propaganda without question. What else have I been wrong about? What other lies did I believe?" Anna leaned closer, lowering her voice even though none of the soldiers spoke German. "I think we believed because it was convenient to believe. Because if we believed those lies, we did not have to question other things. We did not have to look too closely at what was being done in our names. It was easier to think some people were inferior than to admit we were supporting something evil." The words hung in the air between them, a confession of guilt that neither woman had been ready to voice until now. They sat in silence for a few moments, watching the soldiers move efficiently through the column, checking on prisoners, maintaining order, doing their jobs with quiet competence. Young Helga had perhaps changed the most visibly. She followed Sergeant Mitchell's squad with curious eyes, no longer afraid but fascinated. She noticed how they joked with each other during breaks, their laughter genuine and warm. She saw how they helped each other, how the younger soldiers looked to the veterans for guidance, how they took care of their weapons and vehicles with obvious pride. She watched Corporal David Johnson, a young soldier who could not have been more than 21, share his chocolate ration with a fellow soldier who had finished his own. She saw Sergeant Wilson patiently teach a newer soldier how to properly clean his rifle. She observed Lieutenant Hayes reviewing maps with his sergeants, planning the next day's march with meticulous attention to detail. Every observation contradicted what Helga had been taught. These soldiers were not savage or primitive. They were organized, educated, civilized. They had clearly received extensive training. They worked together with a cohesion that spoke of good leadership and strong unit bonds. They were, in every observable way, professional soldiers of a modern military force. Helga found herself walking near Anna and Maria during the afternoon of the second day. She had been gathering courage to speak with the older women, to voice thoughts that felt almost treasonous, even though the regime that had taught her those thoughts no longer existed. "How did they fool us so completely?" Helga asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "I am only 19, but I am not stupid. I learned mathematics, science, history, yet I believed such obvious lies about these men. How is that possible?" Gertrude, walking nearby, turned to answer. "Because they started teaching you those lies when you were very young, child. Before you could think critically, before you could question, they built your entire worldview on a foundation of lies. And then they made sure you never encountered anything that might contradict those lies. They kept us isolated, fed us propaganda, punished anyone who questioned. That is how they fooled us all." During an extended rest on the third day, an incident occurred that would be remembered by many of the women for the rest of their lives. The column had stopped near a small village that had been largely untouched by the fighting. The Americans had arranged for the prisoners to rest for several hours, allowing them to recover from 3 days of walking. The women sat in groups along the roadside, grateful for the break, sharing what little food they had. One of the prisoners, an older woman named Elizabeth Hoffman, collapsed from exhaustion. She was 61 years old, had been walking for days before the American capture, and simply had nothing left. Her body had endured too much. Years of wartime hardship, inadequate nutrition, the stress of defeat and capture, the physical demands of constant movement. She simply folded up on the road, unconscious before she hit the ground. The women around her called out in German, trying to get attention from their guards, panic evident in their voices. Several rushed to Elizabeth's side, trying to help but not knowing what to do. An older woman cradled Elizabeth's head, calling her name, trying to wake her. Corporal Thomas Washington, a 24-year-old from Philadelphia who served as a medic, responded immediately. He had been trained at a military medical school, had treated countless casualties in Italy, and knew exactly what he was doing. When he heard the commotion, he grabbed his medical bag and moved through the column quickly, his long strides covering ground rapidly. Other soldiers cleared a path, ensuring he could reach the patient without delay. Washington knelt beside Elizabeth, his dark hands moving with practiced skill as he checked her pulse, examined her eyes, assessed her condition. The women watched in stunned silence as he worked. His movements were confident and gentle, his face showing concentration and concern. He spoke in English, his words meaningless to the German women, but his tone calm and reassuring. "Pulse is weak but steady," Washington said to the soldiers gathering around. "She is severely dehydrated and malnourished, probably has been for months. She needs fluids, rest and food. Get me water and a blanket." He turned to the German women, knowing they could not understand but wanting to communicate reassurance. "She will be fine," he said slowly, making eye contact with each woman. "Just exhausted. She needs rest and food." Washington elevated Elizabeth's feet slightly, loosening her collar to improve circulation. He wet a cloth with water and gently wiped her face, trying to bring her around slowly. When her eyes fluttered open, he smiled warmly at her, his expression kind and encouraging. "Welcome back, Ma'am," he said gently. "You gave everyone a scare there. But you are going to be fine. Just take it easy." Elizabeth looked up at the black face hovering above her, and for a moment confusion and years of propaganda made her recoil slightly. But Washington did not react to her instinctive fear. He simply continued his examination, checking her vital signs again, offering her small sips of water, his touch professional and gentle. He pulled a chocolate bar from his own rations, broke off a piece, and offered it to Elizabeth. "Energy," he said, miming eating. Slowly. Small bites. Elizabeth took the chocolate with trembling hands, tears beginning to stream down her weathered face. She had not tasted chocolate in years, had forgotten such luxuries existed. But more than the chocolate, she was overwhelmed by the kindness being shown to her by this soldier, this man she had been taught to fear and hate. His hands, which propaganda had told her were the hands of a savage, were the gentlest hands that had touched her in months. His face, which she had been told would frighten her, showed only concern and compassion. The women watching this scene were profoundly affected. Maria felt tears running down her own face, unable to articulate the complex emotions washing over her. Shame, certainly, for having believed such terrible lies about people like Washington. Gratitude for the kindness being shown to one of their own. But also something deeper, a fundamental realignment of her understanding of human worth and dignity. Washington looked up at Lieutenant Hayes, who had approached to assess the situation. "Sir, this one needs to ride in a truck for the rest of the day. She cannot walk anymore. Probably should not have been walking at all given her condition. She needs rest, proper food, and medical attention when we reach the next checkpoint." Hayes nodded immediately. "Put her in the supply truck. Make sure she has water, a blanket, and check on her every hour. If her condition worsens, let me know immediately." "Yes, sir," Washington replied, already preparing to move Elizabeth. He recruited 2 soldiers to help carry her gently to the truck, where they made her comfortable with blankets and provided her with a full canteen of water and extra rations. As Washington helped Elizabeth into the truck, the older woman grabbed his hand, tears streaming down her weathered face. She spoke in German, her voice breaking with emotion, words that Washington could not understand but whose meaning was unmistakable. She was thanking him, apologizing, acknowledging her shame at what she had believed about people like him. Her words poured out in a torrent of emotion, years of guilt and confusion and gratitude all mixed together. Washington simply squeezed her hand gently and nodded, his eyes kind and understanding. "It is all right, ma'am," he said softly. "You just rest now, we will take care of you." Then he returned to his duties. This act of mercy, nothing unusual to him, just part of being a good soldier and a good man. But for the German women who had witnessed it, the moment would never be forgotten. It represented the complete collapse of their propaganda-induced worldview, the moment when they could no longer deny the truth that contradicted everything they had been taught. That evening, as the women settled into another temporary camp, the conversations were different again. The initial shock had transformed into something deeper, a fundamental questioning of everything they had been taught. The facility where they stayed had been a German military barracks, now repurposed as a prisoner processing center. The Americans had provided a hot meal, the first many of the women had eaten in weeks, and the relative comfort of indoor shelter allowed for more extended conversations. Gertrude gathered a group of women around her, her supervisor's instinct for organization asserting itself even in captivity. She stood before perhaps 30 women in one corner of the large room, her voice carrying authority born from years of management experience. "Listen to me, all of you. We must face the truth. We were lied to. About these soldiers, yes, but about so much more. If they lied about this, something so obviously false once we actually encountered it, what else was false? What other lies did we accept without question?" A younger woman named Katharina, perhaps 23 years old, argued back with tears in her eyes. "But how could they lie about something so obvious? We can see with our own eyes that these men are nothing like we were told. They are professional, disciplined, kind. How could the leaders expect us not to eventually see the truth?" Maria, who had been mostly quiet, finally spoke up, her voice carrying the weight of painful realization. "Because they never expected us to meet them. They never expected us to lose. They thought they could keep us isolated forever, keep feeding us lies, and we would never have to face reality. They thought they could control what we saw, what we knew, what we believed. But reality does not care about propaganda. Reality is those soldiers out there, treating us better than we deserve, showing us what we refused to see." Hannah added her own perspective, her medical training giving her a different viewpoint. "As a nurse, I was taught to assess patients objectively, to look at symptoms and evidence rather than assumptions. Yet I failed to apply that same objectivity to people who looked different from me. I accepted lies that contradicted everything I knew about human anatomy and physiology. Black people and white people are biologically almost identical, yet I accepted the idea that skin color determined worth. How could I be so foolish? The question that haunted many of them was, what did this mean for their children? The women worried about the next generation, about how to undo years of indoctrination, about how to teach young people the truth when they had spent their entire lives hearing lies. Helga voiced what many were thinking, her youth making her more willing to articulate difficult thoughts. "When I return home, how do I explain this to my younger brother? He's only 14 and his head is full of the same poison mine was. He believes everything he was taught in school, everything the youth programs told him. How do I tell him that everything he learned was lies? How do I make him understand without breaking his spirit?" "You tell him the truth," said Anna firmly. "You tell him exactly what you saw here. You tell him about Corporal Washington treating Elizabeth with kindness. You tell him about these soldiers who had every reason to hate us, to mistreat us, and instead showed us dignity and professionalism. You tell him so he does not grow up carrying the same hatred and ignorance we did. It will be hard, but it is necessary." Frida, the older woman who had comforted Helga on the first night, added her own thoughts. "We failed our children by not questioning what they were being taught. We trusted authorities who did not deserve trust. We allowed our children to be poisoned with lies because it was easier than confronting uncomfortable truths. Now we must do the hard work of undoing that damage. We must teach them to think critically, to question, to judge people as individuals rather than by group characteristics." The discussion continued late into the night, women sharing their observations, their realizations. their guilt and their hopes for the future. It was a collective reckoning, a group therapy session conducted without professional guidance, but with profound need. They were deconstructing years of propaganda in real time, using the evidence of their own eyes to rebuild their understanding of humanity from the ground up. Sergeant Mitchell, making his rounds through the camp, overheard some of this conversation through an interpreter who was present to facilitate communication between prisoners and guards. The interpreter, a German-American soldier named Carl Schmidt, translated bits of the conversation for Mitchell as they walked. "They are waking up, sir," Mitchell said quietly to Lieutenant Hayes later that evening. "You can see it happening in real time. Most of them have probably never seen a black person before in their lives, and now they are realizing everything they were taught was wrong. It is like watching someone discover the sun rises in the east after being told their whole life it came from the west." Hayes nodded thoughtfully, his face reflecting the dim light of his flashlight as he reviewed the next day's route on a map. "Remember this moment, Sergeant. This is what we fought for, not revenge, not to prove anything, but to show through our actions what free men can be. These women will go home and tell their families what they saw. Some will believe them, some will not. But the truth is out there now. That matters. That matters more than any battle we fought in Italy." Mitchell considered his commander's words. He thought about the long road that had brought him here, from Mississippi sharecropper's son to university student, to soldier to sergeant. He thought about all the racism he had faced, all the times he had been told he was inferior, all the obstacles placed in his path. And now here he was, guarding German prisoners who had supported a regime based on racial superiority, showing them through his conduct that their assumptions were false. There was a certain justice in it, a poetic rightness that satisfied something deep in his soul. By the fourth day, the dynamics had shifted noticeably. Some of the women now smiled tentatively when the soldiers distributed rations. A few had learned basic English phrases. "Thank you, water please, how far to go, good morning." The soldiers, for their part, remained professional but had relaxed slightly, their initial wariness of their prisoners fading as it became clear these women posed no threat. The weather had improved significantly, and the sun shone warm on the column as they made their way through the Bavarian countryside. Spring was advancing rapidly, and the fields showed fresh green growth. Birds sang in the trees, indifferent to human conflicts and reconciliations. The contrast between the peaceful landscape and the devastation of recent months was striking, offering hope that renewal was possible after destruction. Maria found herself walking near Sergeant Mitchell's position one afternoon. She had been working up courage all day, and finally, she spoke in halting English that she had learned years ago in school but rarely used. "Excuse me, please. You are from America?" Mitchell glanced at her, surprised but not unfriendly. He had been watching the countryside, alert for any potential problems, but the question brought his attention to the German woman walking a few meters away. "Yes, ma'am. Mississippi. Your home. It is good there?" she asked, struggling with the language, trying to find words that would convey her genuine curiosity without offending. Mitchell considered how to answer. He thought about segregation laws, segregated schools, the constant discrimination. He thought about water fountains marked colored and white, about restaurants where he could not eat, about schools he could not attend, about opportunities denied based solely on his skin color. But he also thought about his family, his church, the community that had raised him and supported him. He thought about the land, the food, the music, the culture that had shaped him. "It is complicated," he said finally, choosing his words carefully. "But it is home. And it is getting better, slowly." Maria nodded, not fully understanding but sensing the complexity. "You are very professional soldier, very good equipment, very organized. We were told America was weak, disorganized, that your country could not fight properly, but you are not weak, you are very strong. Everything we were told was lies." Mitchell allowed himself a small smile, appreciating her honesty. "No, ma'am. We are not weak. We have our problems, but we do not give up, and we do not quit when things get hard." The conversation was brief, barely lasting 2 minutes, but it represented a bridge being built, one awkward word at a time. Maria walked away feeling slightly more confident in her English, and significantly more convinced that the future, whatever it held, would be based on truth rather than propaganda. Throughout the day, similar small interactions occurred up and down the column. Women asked soldiers questions through interpreters or with hand gestures. Soldiers shared cigarettes with prisoners, showed them photos of their families back home, helped carry heavy bundles without being asked. The boundary between captor and captive was becoming less rigid, replaced by a more human recognition of shared circumstances and mutual respect. On the fifth day, they reached the larger prisoner processing camp, where the women would be properly registered and eventually sorted for release or further detention based on their roles during the conflict. The camp was massive, with rows of barracks, administrative buildings, medical facilities, and supply depots. American flags flew from poles throughout the complex, a constant reminder of who now controlled this territory. The efficiency and organization of the camp was impressive, showing the logistical capabilities of the American military. The Buffalo soldiers would hand the women over to other units and move on to their next assignment. As the transfer was being organized, something unexpected happened. Many of the women approached the soldiers to say goodbye. There were no translators immediately available, but words were not really necessary. The women shook hands with the soldiers, some openly crying, others simply nodding with expressions of gratitude and shame mixed together. Elizabeth, who had recovered her strength riding in the truck and receiving proper medical attention, approached Corporal Washington. An interpreter had been called to help with the processing, and Elizabeth waited until she could speak to Washington through proper translation. The interpreter, Sergeant Schmidt, stood between them as Elizabeth gathered her thoughts. "I am a grandmother," she said, her voice shaking with emotion. "I have 5 grandchildren back in Germany, 3 boys and 2 girls. I will tell them about you. I will tell them what you did for me, how you helped me when you had no reason to. You could have left me there on the road, let me perish from exhaustion and neglect. No one would have questioned it, but you did not. You treated me with kindness, with professional medical skill, with human decency. I will make sure they know that what we were taught was wrong. I promise you this on my life." Washington, typically reserved and uncomfortable with emotional displays, felt his own eyes grow damp. The sincerity in Elizabeth's voice, the weight of her promise, touched something deep in his heart. "You take care, Ma'am. You take care of those grandchildren. Teach them right. Teach them to judge people by their character, not by what they look like. That is all any of us can do. Try to leave the world a little better than we found it." Elizabeth reached out and took both of Washington's hands in her own, holding them tightly. Through the interpreter, she said, "You are a good man, a healer. You have healed more than my body. You have healed some of the poison in my mind. Thank you from the bottom of my heart." Lieutenant Hayes watched the scene with satisfaction. This was victory of a different kind, perhaps more lasting than any battlefield success. These women would return to a devastated Germany, but they would carry with them the truth about what they had witnessed. It was a small thing in the vast tragedy of the conflict, perhaps insignificant in the larger historical record, but small truths, multiplied across thousands of people, could eventually reshape a culture. Hayes himself had a conversation with Gertrude, who approached him through the interpreter, with questions about what would happen to the prisoners next. Her practical nature asserted itself even in these circumstances, and she wanted to understand the process that lay ahead. "We will be released eventually," Gertrude asked through Schmidt. "We will be allowed to go home." Hayes nodded. "Yes, ma'am. You will be processed, your records checked to ensure you were not involved in any activities that would require further detention. For most of you, that should mean release within a few weeks. Then you can return to your homes or what is left of them." Gertrude's face showed a mixture of relief and sorrow. "Home is rubble now. My city, my house, everything is gone. But at least I am alive, and I have learned important truths. I have supervised factory workers for 20 years, Lieutenant. I know good work when I see it. Your unit, your soldiers, they are good men. They have shown us what we should have known all along, that character is not determined by appearance. I will remember this lesson for whatever time I have left." Hayes acknowledged her words with a respectful nod. "Ma'am, you take that lesson home with you. Germany is going to need people like you, people who can admit they were wrong and commit to doing better. Your country has a long road ahead. Make sure the next generation learns from the mistakes of this one. Maria found herself standing before Sergeant Mitchell one last time. She had spent the past 5 days composing something in her limited English, practicing the words in her mind, wanting to get them exactly right. When the opportunity came, she approached Mitchell with determination, her hands clasped tightly in front of her. "Sergeant Mitchell, I must say something," she began carefully, speaking slowly to ensure her English was clear. "All my life, I was taught you and men like you were less than human. I believed this. I am deeply ashamed I believed this. But seeing how you act, how you treat us, I know now it was all lies. You are more human, more decent than many people I knew in my own country. You have shown honor and compassion when you had every right to show neither. I will never forget this. I will tell everyone what I saw here. I promise you this, with everything I am." Mitchell looked at this German woman, seeing in her face the genuine transformation that had occurred over these 5 days. He had faced hatred and discrimination his entire life, had been told countless times that he was inferior, had fought against prejudice every day of his existence. But he had also learned that people could change when confronted with truth, that beliefs instilled through propaganda could crumble when faced with genuine human interaction. "Ma'am," he said quietly, his voice carrying both weariness and hope, "you go home and you remember what you saw here. You remember that hate and lies only work when people are kept apart, when they do not have to actually interact, when they can be fed propaganda without experiencing reality. When people actually meet, actually see each other as human beings, those lies fall apart. They cannot survive contact with truth. You take that knowledge home with you. Teach your children better than you were taught. Teach your grandchildren to question, to think critically, to judge people as individuals rather than by group characteristics." Maria nodded, tears streaming down her face. "I will, I promise I will. You have given me a gift, Sergeant Mitchell. You have given me back my humanity, shown me that I can still learn, still grow, still become better than I was. I will not waste that gift." The women were formed into new columns and led away by other units toward the processing centers within the camp. The Buffalo soldiers watched them go, then turned to their vehicles to prepare for movement to their next assignment. For them, this had been a relatively easy few days, a break from the intensity of combat operations. They did not realize how profound an impact they had made, how many lives they had changed, how many minds they had opened. They had simply done their duty professionally and humanely, never imagining that their conduct would resonate through generations. But the story does not end there. In fact, in many ways, it was only beginning. In the months and years that followed, as Germany lay in ruins and its people struggled to rebuild both their country and their understanding of the world, the stories spread. Women who had been prisoners told their families about the Black American soldiers who had treated them with unexpected dignity. They described the professionalism, the kindness, the humanity they had witnessed. Many faced skepticism from those who still clung to old beliefs, who insisted that the stories must be exaggerated or fabricated, but others listened and learned, and slowly, painfully, began to question what they had been taught. Maria returned to Munich in late May of 1945 to find her city devastated beyond recognition. Entire neighborhoods had been reduced to rubble. Buildings that had stood for centuries were now just piles of broken stone and twisted metal. Her apartment building was gone, simply gone, as if it had never existed. She moved in with her sister's family, who had somehow survived with their small home mostly intact, and began the difficult work of rebuilding her life from nothing. But she never stopped telling the story of those 5 days on the road in April. She told her nephews and nieces, told neighbors gathering water from communal pumps, told other women standing in long lines for rations. She spoke in detail about Corporal Washington's gentle hands as he cared for Elizabeth, about Sergeant Mitchell's quiet dignity and professional bearing, about Lieutenant Hayes's fair and respectful command. She made people understand that she had seen the truth with her own eyes, that this was not theory or propaganda, but direct experience. When one of her nephews, a 15-year-old boy named Klaus, who had been thoroughly indoctrinated in the youth programs, made a disparaging comment about black people during a family dinner, Maria sat him down and told him the entire story in excruciating detail. She described the shock of first seeing the buffalo soldiers, the gradual realization that everything she had believed was false, the shame of recognizing her own complicity in accepting lies. She made Klaus understand that she had been wrong, profoundly wrong, and that admitting that wrong was the first step toward becoming a better person. Klaus listened, initially resistant, but gradually absorbing his aunt's words. He had trusted the teachers and youth leaders who had filled his head with propaganda, but he also trusted his aunt who had never lied to him. The cognitive dissonance was painful, forcing him to question everything he thought he knew. But eventually, like Maria before him, he chose truth over comfortable lies. Years later, Klaus would become a teacher himself, dedicated to ensuring that German children never again received the kind of poisonous education he had experienced. Young Helga returned to what remained of Dresden, her hometown having been devastated in the horrific firestorm of February. She had lost almost everything: her parents in the burning, her home reduced to ash, her entire childhood erased in one night of terror. She lived with distant relatives and struggled to find meaning in a world that had collapsed completely around her. But she had gained something unexpected during those 5 days with the Buffalo Soldiers, a broader understanding of humanity that gave her a foundation for rebuilding her life. Helga became a teacher after completing her education in the new Germany that emerged from the ashes of the old. She made it her mission to teach her students about the dangers of propaganda, the importance of critical thinking, and the necessity of judging people as individuals rather than by group characteristics. She never explicitly told her students about her time as a prisoner, but she drew on those experiences constantly, using them to inform her teaching philosophy. She created lessons that challenged her students to question assumptions, to seek evidence, to resist easy answers based on prejudice. One of her students, a bright girl named Ingrid, asked her once why she was so passionate about teaching them to question authority. Helga had paused, considering how to answer, and finally said, "Because I once accepted lies without questioning them, and those lies poisoned my mind and made me complicit in terrible things. I was not much older than you are now, and I thought I knew the truth. But I knew nothing. I had been fed propaganda my entire life and had never thought to question it. I do not want you to make the same mistake. Question everything, Ingrid. Demand evidence. Think for yourself. That is the only way to avoid being manipulated by those who would use your mind for their own purposes." Gertrude, practical to the end, used her experience as a teaching tool in a different way. She helped organize community reconstruction efforts in Stuttgart, bringing her factory management skills to the massive task of rebuilding a shattered city. She insisted on international cooperation wherever possible, arguing that Germany's future lay in engagement with the world rather than isolation. She corresponded with other women who had been in that column, maintaining contact across the divided Germany that emerged after the conflict, sharing stories and supporting each other's efforts to promote understanding. Gertrude lived until 1973, long enough to see Germany transformed into a prosperous democracy. She never forgot those 5 days in April 1945, and she spoke about them frequently in her later years. She told her grandchildren about Sergeant Mitchell and Lieutenant Hayes, about the professional conduct and unexpected kindness of the Buffalo Soldiers. She made sure they understood that the Germany she had supported in her youth had been based on lies, and that those lies had led to catastrophe. Elizabeth kept her promise to Washington. She lived to see her grandchildren grow into adults, and she told them the story so many times they could recite it themselves. The youngest grandson, Franz, was particularly moved by the story. He eventually emigrated to America in 1968, settled in Philadelphia, and spent years trying to locate Washington to thank him in person for saving his grandmother's life and opening her mind to truth. Franz never found Washington, despite extensive searches through military records and veteran organizations. He learned that Washington had returned to Philadelphia after the conflict, had worked as a nurse in a hospital for decades, and had passed away in 1970. Franz was devastated to learn he had missed his chance by just a few years. But the search itself became a family legend, passed down through generations as a reminder of the debt they owed to a soldier's kindness and of the importance of expressing gratitude while we still can. The Buffalo Soldiers themselves received little official recognition for this particular duty. Their combat achievements in Italy were documented in military records, their courage under fire recorded in after-action reports and commendations. But these quiet days guarding prisoners generated no official reports of significance. There were no medals for treating enemies with dignity, no citations for professional conduct that challenged propaganda. The work was considered routine, unremarkable, just another duty in the long process of securing peace in Europe. Yet for the men involved, it was meaningful work. They had demonstrated through their conduct that the lies told about them were false. They had shown that dignity and professionalism transcended race. They had represented not just America, but also every black person who had been told they were inferior. Each interaction with the German prisoners was an opportunity to disprove prejudice through simple humanity. Sergeant Mitchell returned to Mississippi after the conflict ended. He faced the same discrimination he had known before, the same segregated world that treated him as inferior despite his military service and combat record. He could not eat in most restaurants, could not vote without facing intimidation, had to use separate facilities marked for colored people. The contrast between his treatment in Germany and his treatment in his own country was bitter and frustrating. But Mitchell carried with him the knowledge that he had represented his country and his people with honor. When the civil rights movement gained momentum in the 1950s and 60s, Mitchell was active in his local community, organizing voter registration drives, supporting integration efforts, marching for equal rights. He always told younger activists about those days in Germany, when a group of German women learned to see beyond the color of skin after just 5 days of interaction. He used the story to illustrate that prejudice was learned and therefore could be unlearned, that direct contact between people was the enemy of bigotry. Mitchell lived until 1987, long enough to see substantial progress in civil rights, but also to recognize how much work remained. In his final years, he gave several interviews to historians documenting the experiences of black soldiers in the conflict. He spoke at length about Italy, about the combat and the discrimination within the military itself, but he also spoke about those 5 days guarding German prisoners, about the women's faces when they first saw black soldiers, about watching their prejudices crumble in real time. One historian asked him if he felt vindicated by the experience, if it had felt like justice to show German women that their propaganda was false. Mitchell had thought carefully before answering. "Vindication suggests I needed to prove something," he said slowly. "But I already knew my worth. I knew I was as good as any man, black or white. What happened with those prisoners was not about me. It was about them, about their opportunity to learn truth. I was just doing my job. The fact that doing my job well contradicted their lies was their problem, not mine." Lieutenant Hayes used his military experience and education to become a professor after the conflict. He taught history at Howard University, a historically black college in Washington, D.C., and made sure his students understood that changing hearts and minds sometimes happened in unexpected ways, through simple human interaction and consistent demonstration of character, rather than through grand gestures or dramatic confrontations. Hayes kept in contact with several of his fellow officers from the 92nd Division, and they would occasionally gather for reunions. They would discuss their experiences in Italy, the friends they had lost, the battles they had won. But they also discussed those strange days when they had served as guards and unknowingly as educators. They spoke about the responsibility they had felt, the awareness that their conduct would either confirm or disprove years of propaganda. Hayes wrote several academic papers about the psychological impact of propaganda and the power of direct experience to overcome indoctrination. He drew on his experiences with the German prisoners, though he changed names and details to protect the privacy of those involved. His work contributed to the understanding of how propaganda works and how it can be counteracted, insights that remained relevant long after the specific context of the conflict had faded into history. The broader significance of these encounters lay in what they revealed about the power of direct experience to overcome propaganda. The German women in that column had been subjected to years of indoctrination, their worldviews shaped by a regime that used dehumanization as a political tool. Yet 5 days of actual interaction with black American soldiers was enough to shatter those beliefs completely for many of them. The propaganda could not survive contact with reality. This phenomenon repeated itself across Germany in the final months and aftermath of the conflict. Hundreds of thousands of German prisoners encountered American forces that included significant numbers of black soldiers. Each encounter became an opportunity for propaganda to confront reality, and reality won every time. The lies simply could not survive when people actually met face to face, when Germans could see with their own eyes that black soldiers were professional, capable, and humane. The women who experienced this transformation became important voices in post-conflict German society, even if their influence was often informal and local rather than nationally recognized. They taught their children and grandchildren different values than they had been taught. They pushed back against lingering prejudices in their communities. They served as living proof that people could change, could recognize their mistakes, and could commit to doing better. The irony was profound and multi-layered, something that struck everyone who thought seriously about what had happened. These black American soldiers, fighting for a country that denied them full equality, had shown more humanity and professionalism than the supposedly superior forces they had defeated. These men, descendants of enslaved people, had treated their former enemies with dignity that put their captors to shame. These soldiers, who faced discrimination at home, had represented American values abroad more effectively than any propaganda campaign could have achieved. The encounter also highlighted the strange contradictions of American society in 1945. The 92nd Infantry Division consisted of men who could not eat at the same restaurants as white Americans, could not attend the same schools, faced constant barriers and discrimination based solely on their skin color. Yet here they were, wearing American uniforms, representing American power, demonstrating American values of equality and human dignity to people who had been taught by their own government to hate and fear difference. Some of the Buffalo Soldiers found bitter humor in this contradiction. They joked darkly about liberating Europe from racial tyranny while returning home to segregation and segregation. They noted the absurdity of German prisoners being shocked at their humanity, while white Americans took that same humanity for granted or actively denied it. But many also saw hope in what they had accomplished. If German women raised on intensive propaganda could change their views so dramatically after just a few days of direct experience, perhaps Americans could do the same. Perhaps the experiences of the conflict, which had brought together people from different backgrounds in unprecedented ways, could catalyze change at home as well. The psychological impact on the German women was complex and lasting. Many experienced cognitive dissonance, the uncomfortable feeling that comes from holding contradictory beliefs. They had believed one thing about black people and suddenly faced overwhelming evidence that their beliefs were false. For some, this was liberating, opening their minds to question other propaganda they had accepted. They began to wonder what else they had been wrong about, what other lies they had believed. For others, it was deeply disturbing, forcing them to confront their own complicity in a system built on lies. And that concludes our story. If you made it this far, please share your thoughts in the comments. What part of this historical account surprised you most? Don't forget to subscribe for more untold stories from World War II, and check out the video on screen for another incredible tale from history. Until next time.